Good evening. Welcome to Birkbeck and to this lecture organised by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. It's quite hot in here, and there's nothing we can do about it, so I apologise for that. I can only promise that the physical heat will be matched by the intellectual heat that we have later this evening. Omer Bartov, our lecturer this evening, is Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He's a historian of the Holocaust, of genocide, and of Galicia. His recent books include Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Bushash, which was published in 2018 and won the Jewish National Book Awards. In 2022 came Borderlands, Making and Unmaking of the Galician Past. And last year came Genocides, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, first-person history in times of crisis. Omer Bartov is not only an outstanding historian, he is also, and increasingly, a public intellectual who speaks and whose voice is heard in the United States, in Europe, and in Israel. In 2023, Omer co-wrote the statement for The Elephant in the Room, issued in August of that year. There, he wrote, "There cannot be democracy for Jews in Israel as long as Palestinians live under a regime of apartheid." This was a statement signed by something like 2,500 academics, including myself. The statement linked the crisis of representative government created by the Netanyahu government's assault on Israel's independent judiciary with Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, where Palestinians lack basic rights, including the right to vote and protest, and face constant violence. Later, in 2023, Omer Bartov was a vocal critic of Israel's war on Gaza following Hamas's horrific attack on the 7th of October. By the summer of 2024, he was willing to label that attack on Gaza a genocide on account of the death, displacement, and destruction that had been wrought. But as we approach the subject of this evening's lecture, it may be important for us to keep in mind Omer's earlier intervention, his concern and fear for Israel's democracy and the connection of those fears with his compelling criticisms of Israel's ill treatment of Palestinians over many years. Omer will speak for around 45 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions after that. It is then with a great sense of anticipation and urgency that I, and I'm sure we, look forward to the lecture this evening, Israel, What Went Wrong? Please welcome Professor Omer Bartov.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming here this evening. By way of introduction, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background. In 2022, the last 3 months of 2022, I was doing research in Israel for a book that I'd been thinking about for several years. During those 3 months, I interviewed approximately 55 people, about 2/3 of them Jewish Israeli, and 1/3 of them Palestinian citizens of Israel. Mostly people, or almost all people who belong to my generation, that is, people who were born in the first decade after the establishment of the State of Israel. And these were in-depth interviews in which I tried to speak or to hear those people speak about the connection to the place, how it was formed from their childhood to the present, and how it has changed over time. And that was part of a concept for a book that I'm still engaged in. And there were very interesting insights that came out from those in-depth interviews. These were interviews that lasted often at least 2, often 3 hours. Often very emotional, because people were speaking about their childhood, about their parents, often came from highly traumatized families, whether they were families that had come from Europe, from the Holocaust, some families that had come from North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, Jewish families, and Palestinian families that had undergone the experience, their parents, the experience of the Nakba, of the expulsion of the Palestinians. Now, I ended that in early January 2023, and shortly thereafter, everything happened. That is, a new government was formed by Netanyahu at the end of 2022, by Benjamin Netanyahu. Then was the process of the government's attempt at what was called a judicial overhaul, which was really a judicial coup, an attempt to greatly weaken the Supreme Court. And then, of course, and there were massive demonstrations in Israel. We issued the statement, the elephant in the room, saying that while we greatly supported these demonstrations, they were missing much of the point. That is, the demonstrations refused to speak. The demonstrators, the leadership of the protest movement refused to speak about the occupation. That was in August. And in October, of course, all hell broke loose, and it's still ongoing. And during the months that came after that, I found it very hard to continue writing this book that I had researched, because I was so, like all of us, I think, distraught, and became increasingly sucked into writing and thinking and talking about what was going on. And as a result of that, I eventually thought that I need to write a book. And not the book that I was writing, but a preliminary book that would somehow organize for myself and maybe for others some of the thoughts that I was having about what was going on and where was it coming from. What were the roots for what I came to call what went wrong. And this is what I want to talk with you about today. And potentially this will be the title of that book, Israel, What Went Wrong. And some of you know that What Went Wrong was the title of another book by Bernard Lewis that has its own reputation. So what I try to sketch in this book is the tragic transformation, as I see it, of Zionism, a movement that sought to emancipate European Jewry and liberate it from oppression and persecution, into a state ideology of ethno-nationalism increasingly focused on the exclusion and violent domination of Palestinians under Israeli rule. The book asks, how is it possible that a state founded in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, an event that greatly enhanced international legitimacy for the creation of a national home for the Jews, stands today credibly accused of perpetrating large-scale war crimes, forcible displacement of civilian populations, and crimes against humanity? By what bitter cunning of history have we come to the point that not even 8 decades after the Jewish state was established in 1948, the same year in which the Genocide Convention was adopted by the United Nations in direct response to the Nazi extermination of European Jewry, Israel appears to be engaged in a genocidal undertaking with almost total impunity from the very international legal regime set up after World War II to prevent and punish this crime. And how do we come to terms with the fact that Israel's war of destruction is being conducted with wide support, laced with denial and indifference by most of its Jewish citizens? In order to understand the violent events currently unfolding in Israel and the occupied territories, we need to trace their roots far back into the past. Of course, that's my view, especially because I'm a historian, so I always have to go back. Some would argue that what we are watching at the moment with shock and horror is the inevitable consequence of Zionist settler colonialism set into motion in the late 19th century. Now, in part, that is true. But what interests me here, and what makes the history leading to this moment all the more tragic, is the process seen as inevitable only in retrospect, whereby a hopeful, albeit also increasingly desperate, appeal to humanitarianism and tolerance, the rule of law and protection of minorities that characterized the beginning of Jewish self-emancipation gradually acquired all the traits of the relentless, remorseless, and increasingly racist ethno-nationalism from which Zionism had sought to liberate European Jewry. Was this in fact an inevitable development, or was it the product of particular circumstances and decisions? Is there a crucial moment at which things began turning in one direction rather than the other? Can the grim logic of events be reversed, or are we observing an unstoppable rush toward the destruction of others and self-annihilation as a society and state proclaiming democratic and liberal values? Now, these questions have kept me up at night since the Hamas attack and the massacre of October 7th, 2023, as well as Israel's violent, ongoing response to it. But they have preoccupied me with ever greater intensity in the years leading to the current crisis. Indeed, as I've come to realize, they have been part of my own making since I can remember myself. I was born and raised in Israel, member of that first generation, born in the first decades of the state's existence. Less typically, my father was born in what was then mandatory Palestine, shortly after his parents arrived from Poland. My paternal grandfather, who grew up in dire poverty and was exposed to local anti-Semitism, was a staunch Zionist. Economically, the family did only marginally better in Palestine, and my father had to leave school and find employment and to help support the household. At the age of 17, he volunteered to the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, both to fight the Nazis and to escape the constraints of destitution and religion at a home that, to his mind, had retained all the hallmarks of a diaspora mentality, galutiut, as it's called in Hebrew. He too was a Zionist throughout his life. Some of you may know he was also a well-known author and journalist in Israel. His name is Omer Bartov. His encounter with the survivors of the Holocaust in Europe remained etched on his soul. Unlike many other members of his generation, he insisted that despite being a Sabra, that is a native son of Eretz Israel, he was first and foremost a Jew. But he abandoned his father's religious practice and was always attached to the left in its various permutations. He never quite reconciled with my departure from Israel. But in the last decade of his long life, he clearly detected the direction in which his beloved country was headed. In many ways, he could no longer recognize it. He insisted with growing vehemence that Benjamin Netanyahu was the great destroyer of Zionism, as my father had understood the movement to which he had dedicated his life. My mother was born in Poland and came to Palestine with her parents and two brothers at the age of 11. Her father, too, was a staunch Zionist and an observant Jew. Economically quite well off in Poland, which is now actually in Ukraine, the place they came from, the family was plunged into poverty upon arrival in the Promised Land. But no one ever complained about my grandfather's choice to leave Poland, which was growing increasingly unstable, poor, and anti-Semitic. Hebrew was my mother's third or fourth language. But like my father, she pulled herself out of the mire by her own bootstraps, and thanks to an educational system that rewarded talent, ambition, and perseverance, which she had in ample amounts, she did quite well. My parents were both students at the Hebrew University in 1948, when the war broke out. They went to fight straight out of the classroom and lost many of their friends who joined those early so-called student companies. She was a Zionist too, although perhaps not as fervently as my father. Had he let her continue her studies in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s, instead of insisting that they go back to the Jewish state, partly because the children forgot to speak Hebrew, meaning me and my sister, I suspect that she would have had an academic career at an American university, and I would have been a full-fledged American. As I grew up, I realized that although all families were different, most of those I knew had one thing in common. They had lost virtually all the relatives who stayed behind in Europe. I was lucky to have two sets of grandparents, which was quite uncommon among my friends. But both my father's and my mother's extended families in Poland were all murdered. No one survived. We lived in mutilated, that's by the way, the book that was mentioned, Anatomy of a Genocide, is a story of my mother's hometown of Bucha. We lived in mutilated families, and the sense of loss and mourning compounded by personal trauma in those families that included Holocaust survivors was ubiquitous, though rarely articulated. Told that we were the first generation of our people's resurrection, we never questioned our presence, existence, and future in Israel. Yet over time, even as the visible signs of the destruction of Palestinian culture all around us gradually diminished, some of us became increasingly aware that our own resurrection had come at the price of another people's catastrophe. That awareness could generate contradictory responses: guilt and regret, or negation and denial, a hope for redress and reconciliation, or a conscious or unconscious will to eradicate and erase. The mental landscape of contemporary Israel is still filled with traces of these contradictory sentiments, although at the moment the urge for destruction and erasure has by far the upper hand. Born in a strong left-wing kibbutz, I spent the first 18 months of my life at a children's home, since socialist ideology at the time perceived the family as an obstacle to collective solidarity. But I grew up in Tel Aviv, in neighborhoods where the remnants of Palestinian villages whose residents had fled Israeli troops were still quite visible, and we used to play there, cops and robbers. I joined the IDF in 1973, just in time to experience the Yom Kippur War and the subsequent war of attrition in the Syrian enclave, as it was called. Now it's again the Syrian enclave. History does strange things. And I completed my service 4 years later as an officer and a company commander. After studying in Israel and at Oxford, I taught for several years at Tel Aviv University before taking up a fellowship at Harvard in 1989, which led to over 3 decades of living and teaching in the United States. I've always maintained close links with Israel. My parents are buried in the kibbutz of my birth. My eldest son lives there with his family, and most of my best friends are there. Until the current war, I regularly visited the country, often 3 times a year, occasionally staying for lengthy periods. It is in multiple senses my home and my homeland. But like my father, I too now feel increasingly estranged from it. It seems to be a different, strange, and threatening place, whose people, including some of my friends, have been transformed, perhaps irretrievably. It is a country trapped in its own sense of shock and trauma, and in deep denial of the crimes being committed in its name by its people, including the children and grandchildren of people who at other times, under different circumstances, would have easily been able to perceive the horrors they now accept, deny, or strive to ignore. So the book I'm writing is based in many ways on years of learning, teaching, and writing about war and genocide, Jewish history and the Holocaust, and the history of Israel-Palestine. More specifically, since October 7th, I've been intensively engaged, as David mentioned, in speaking and writing about how I understand what is happening on the ground. What are the immediate and deeper causes of this explosion of violence, and where things may be heading? Some of the essays I've written include an op-ed that I published in November 2023, so that's just 2 months, or just a month after the Hamas attack, in the New York Times, in which I warned that the Israeli assault on Gaza might become a genocidal campaign if it were not halted. An essay published in March 2024 by the Council for Global Cooperation on the misuses of Holocaust memory and what I call, and I'll get back to that, the never again syndrome. An essay in The Nation in July 2024 on the origins of anti-Semitism and its current weaponization. An essay published in last August in The Guardian describing my visit to Israel in June 23, attempting to gauge the mentality of the Jewish population there after 9 months of war, and arguing that enough evidence had accumulated by that point to show that the IDF was indeed engaged in a genocidal campaign in Gaza. And finally, an op-ed in Le Monde in October assessing the first year of the war and the motivation of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to pursue and continue it. These and other essays and papers and lectures serve me, I think, as a basis to now engage with this book, which is taking the form of 9 essays that are some interconnected essays. And what I'll do in a moment is try to go through some of the arguments there with you. I was also, and I think some of us who teach are aware of that, deeply inspired by a seminar that I decided to teach a year earlier, but so happened that I taught it last semester, on oppression and resistance. Because that seminar included many of the classic, if you like, seminal texts of the last century and a half on this theme. And I draw them in writing this book. These included texts by Frederick Douglass, Leon Pinsker, Joseph Conrad, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ralph Ellison, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Primo Levi, and Elias Khoury. And I expect that most of you know these writers. So let me now briefly describe how I go about trying to ask what went wrong. I begin by focusing especially on how the realities of centuries-long Jewish life in the European diaspora were transformed by the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the emancipation of the Jews. Ironically, just as the Jews came out of the ghetto, as the historian Jacob Katz called it, and joined the mainstream of European society in the 19th century, they were increasingly associated with the ills of modernity, urbanization, and the erosion of traditional society. It was under these circumstances that modern anti-Semitism emerged. And modern anti-Semitism is a very different phenomenon from what is referred to as anti-Semitism, even though the word had actually not even been coined. So it was under these circumstances that modern anti-Semitism emerges in ideology and a political platform for mass mobilization of movements and parties. As the influential German historian Heinrich von Treitschke declared in 1880, quote, "The Jews are our misfortune." One result of the politicization and popularization of anti-Semitism was the Jewish quest to solve the newly emergent Jewish question through a variety of political movements, one of which was Zionism. Now, as I talk about Zionism, I begin with a fascinating text, I assume that some of you have read that, by the Jewish author Leo Pinsker. This is an essay from 1882 titled Ode to Emancipation. Pinsker writes or describes the Jewish people in the diaspora as, quote, "the uncanny form of one of the dead walking among the living, a ghost-like apparition of a living corpse, a people without unity or organization, without land or other bonds of unity, no longer alive, and yet walking among the living, a spectral form without precedence in history." This is what he calls ubiquitous fear of the Jewish ghost, which has passed down the generations and the centuries. Eventually, he writes, culminated in Judeophobia. That's his term for what we call anti-Semitism. And so, what I will try, or what I'm trying to write in this chapter, is how Zionism develops as a response both to the rise of modern anti-Semitism and to the emergence of nationalism, and most especially to its ethno-nationalist variety adopted by the newly created nation-states of Eastern Europe, which is where most of the Jews live. following the destruction of World War I, of the multi-ethnic empires that had existed before that. Zionism sought to liberate Jews from persecution, exclusion, and violence, and to provide them with the same kind of national self-determination that their neighbors had accomplished. But that liberation could be implemented only outside the territories of mass Jewish habitation, where they were increasingly unwanted. Instead, Zionism increasingly envisioned the Jews' religious and mythical ancestral land as the site where a newly declared Jewish nation would be resurrected. Now, this doesn't happen immediately. There's a long background to this, but I won't get into it right now. Now, from here, I want to move to one of the major complexes of the debate, and that is the discourse, on the one hand, on the Holocaust, and on the other, on the Nakba, that is, on the mass displacement of the Palestinians in 1948 as part of the creation of the Jewish state, which was the culmination of the Zionist endeavor beginning in the 1880s. It's important to put these two events in dialogue with each other and to position them within broader conceptual, political, and historical contexts. These two traumatic events are often discussed separately, in fact, often, almost always. Indeed, there are those who find merely evoking the Holocaust and the Nakba in the same context to be scandalous, both because of the enduring traumatic effects and thanks to each group's insistence on the exclusivity of its own victimhood, which results in resistance to comparison and analogy. In fact, the two events are inextricably linked historically, personally, biographically, and as part of politics of memory. And they have respectively become constitutive of Palestinian and Israeli national identities. That's also part of the interviews that I was conducting that I told you at the beginning. This came up the whole time. It has been argued that for this reason, rather than producing a senseless competition of victimhood, reflecting jointly on these two crucial events can have a transformative effect on Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian mutual understanding. In turn, this understanding also means that the Holocaust and the Nakba must be situated within a larger context of colonialism, population policies, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, all of which entail an urge to homogenize, transfer, and eradicate populations. The Holocaust was part of a Nazi endeavor to create a German living space, a Lebensraum, from which the Jews would be removed as a rootless and landless people. The Nakba, for its part, was the culmination of colonial views of Palestine as an empty space where landless Jews could regain their roots, resulting in the displacement of the indigenous Palestinian population by displaced Jews from Europe. So this then brings me to the core question, which is the transformation of Zionism into a state ideology. In 1948, just as the Palestinians were being expelled, the Jewish leadership issued a Declaration of Independence. It's called the Scroll of Independence. This document, filled with lofty assurances of equality and justice for all citizens of the new state, regardless of ethnicity, creed, and gender, was to be followed by a constitution that would have enshrined these promises in law. But no constitution was ever agreed upon. I wish to argue, and as I say, this is in a sense the central issue that I'm interested in, that in the absence of a constitution, Zionism was transformed from a movement and a quest for Jewish self-emancipation, individual transformation and self-determination, and of course liberation from persecution and anti-Semitism, into a state ideology. Not unlike other political concepts and philosophies, for instance, socialism and fascism, that changed dramatically when they took over states, Zionism began to transform as soon as it became the ideology of the state. Now, I'll just say that obviously in the 1920s, 1930s, there's both growing immigration of Jews to Palestine. The numbers increased tremendously, and that means more and more taking over of Palestinian land and more conflict and friction between Jews and Palestinians. But it is also a time of growing persecution of Jews in Europe. So the Zionism plays this double role of both promising Jews a place of their own and rescue from persecution, and at the same time of settling land that it is taking away from the people who live there, that is, of establishing its own political entity. So this ambivalence is constantly playing one side against the other. In 1948, a state is established. Zionism has accomplished its goal, but it's not put aside. It remains, or becomes at that point, the ideology of the state. So arguably, a constitution based on the progressive principles of the Declaration of Independence, and often this term is used in Israel in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, would have served to constrain the worst impulses of Zionism and to open a path toward a liberal society for all its remaining citizens, because of course as this was being issued, Palestinians were actually being removed. Simultaneously this was going on. Instead, over time, the singular focus of Zionism determined that in the competition between being a Jewish and a democratic state, the state tilted increasingly toward the former. First, in the ethno-nationalist sense, and then also in the theological one, and eventually in an increasingly exclusionary, racist, violent, and authoritarian sense. In certain respects, then, the history of the state was decided when the prospect of a constitution was abandoned. And it wasn't just abandoned, there were reasons why, of course, that we can talk about. Rather than recognizing that Zionism had accomplished its goal of a Jewish state, a Jewish majority state, in 1948, and making the building of a society focused on equality, justice, and prosperity for all its citizens into a national goal, Zionism became the driving force of an increasingly militaristic, centralized, expansionist, and intolerant ethno-national state. Now, part of the discourse that facilitated this transformation is what I call the never again syndrome. In the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, memorials went up everywhere, proclaiming a commitment to never again let such inhumanity happen again. But there was no consensus over what it was that would never be repeated, since the Holocaust was already over. There were those who pledged never to let genocide of any kind happen. Indeed, in 1948, the United Nations adopted a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. In Israel, however, the pledge was interpreted differently, to mean never again any genocide of Jews. While in its early years, Israel was uncomfortable with the legacy of the Shoah as an event in which millions of people went, so to speak, as sheep to the slaughter, by the 1980s, the Holocaust began to serve right-wing governments as a glue around which the diverse and at times hostile sectors of the Jewish population could unite. The Holocaust was not only perceived now as a past event, but also as a future, indeed as a potentially imminent threat. This made for the creation of a collective mentality, both fragile and aggressive. Created as a haven for Jews from anti-Semitic violence, Israel began to perceive itself as always being threatened with extinction, even as its regional military superiority became increasingly unchallenged. This fear of another Auschwitz, always lurking behind the corner, also provided license for exercising disproportionate violence against anyone who threatened the state. And the argument that during the Holocaust the nations of the world had not come to the Jews' rescue was also employed, and is being employed, to imply that when under threat, Israel had no obligation to accept any international norms, including those put into place as one of the main lessons of the Holocaust itself, since its priority, the Jewish state's priority, had always to remain its bare existence. So this brings me to the second aspect of this mentality that has been created in the state of Israel, and that is the state of occupation. For most of its existence, 58 out of 77 years that have passed since its establishment, Israel has occupied lands containing large numbers of Palestinians. At the moment, approximately 7 million Jewish Israeli citizens control 7 million Palestinians, of whom 2 million are Israeli citizens whose rights are restricted in myriad ways by the state, while 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza have practically no rights at all. In the view of most Jewish Israeli citizens, and that's sort of shocking to think about it, and I had to think about it myself over time, in the view of most Jewish Israeli citizens, those Palestinians do not even have the right to have rights. One can say that Israel was a full democracy only for 6 months, between December 1966 and June 1967. That is between the time in which the military rule imposed on the Palestinian citizens of the state after the War of 1948 was lifted, and when Israel came to occupy territories to which many of the Palestinians expelled in 1948 had fled. That is, they fled to the West Bank and to Gaza. This ongoing occupation has had numerous effects on the country's politics, mentality, and norms. With time, the occupied Palestinians underwent social death as far as Jewish Israeli citizens were concerned, hidden behind a complex of separation walls, fences, bypass roads, and checkpoints. When Jewish citizens encountered occupied Palestinians, apart from as mostly invisible blue-collar workers, it was the soldiers enforcing the occupation, whose conduct was meant to show who was boss, breaking into people's homes in the middle of the night or humiliating Palestinians seeking to move across their lands or to get to their jobs, schools, or hospitals through endless checkpoints and other barriers. The occupation has thus dehumanized the occupied and the occupiers alike. As Omer Bartov noted in 1950, and I'm quoting, colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism, a process whereby regression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread, so that at the end of all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of the country, and slowly but surely it proceeds toward savagery. This is a quote from Fanon. This is the process we have seen in Israel, most prominently with the Settlement Project, which has now brought some 750,000 Jews into the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and created an apartheid regime whereby 2/3 of the population live under an arbitrary military legal system, whereas the remaining third enjoys all the rights and privileges of Jewish Israeli citizens, although they're extraterritorial citizens. So at this point, let me turn to October 7th and the war in Gaza. The attack by Hamas was precipitated both by domestic disarray in Israel, and we talked about the protest movement between February and October 2023, that attempt to stop the judicial overhaul, and by the attempt by Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States to normalize relations and open up trade routes to India. While the protests appear to show domestic Israeli weakness, the diplomatic maneuver threatened to indefinitely marginalize the Palestinian issue, which Netanyahu had long argued and persuaded large numbers of people in Israel and across the world could be managed and needed no political solution. We can manage the occupation. The deeper reasons were, of course, the ongoing occupation and the growing despair of the population of the Gaza Strip that had lived under an Israeli siege for 16 years and whose livelihood, education, health, and future prospects appeared increasingly dismal. The Hamas attack deeply humiliated the IDF, instilled a sense of profound insecurity in the Israeli civilian population, and exposed the incompetence of the government. It also enraged the Jewish public that had become used to thinking of Palestinians as people who could easily be cowed into submission. The response was like that of other colonial systems when confronted by indigenous resistance, a desire to pulverize the rebels into submission, and an assertion that the very savagery of the massacre proved the need to so-called exterminate the brutes, to quote Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And this was terminology that was flying around on the Israeli media. If we are to make sense of the Israeli public's indifference to the massive death toll in Gaza, however critical many Israelis may be of their own government and army, and there is both criticism of the army and of the government and indifference to what is happening to Palestinians at the same time, we must understand that when the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, called Hamas, and by extension the rest of the population of Gaza, human animals, he reflected the sentiments of a majority of the population, at least since October 7. But in point of fact, instilled in people's mind also as a result of long-term normalized occupation. As Césaire notes, and I'm quoting, colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man, since it is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, so that the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends to objectively to transform himself into an animal. This, as Césaire famously points out, is the boomerang effect, or le choc en retour, of colonization. So Israel's response to the October 7th attack leads me to examine and analyze the nature of the war in Gaza and its apparent goals, as well as its effect on the regime of international law. The killing of some 900 civilians, including children and the elderly, as well as reported cases of rape, and the taking of some 250 hostages by Hamas, mostly Jewish. Not all the victims were Jews. There were foreign workers and there were Bedouin who were also killed or taken hostage by Hamas, but the majority were Jews. All these actions can certainly be defined as a war crime and a crime against humanity. But the actual desire to physically resist oppression and dehumanization is not only legitimate and understandable, but also legal under international law, especially when it forms part of a struggle for national self-determination. We can condemn the barbarity of the attack and yet condone the right to resist illegal occupation. It is also the most basic action of human self-assertion by the oppressed. As Frederick Douglass wrote about his fight with a slave owner who tried to whip him, this, he writes, was the turning point in my life. It rekindled in my breast the smoldering embers of liberty and revived a sense of my manhood. I was changed. I was a changed being after that fight. I was nothing before. I was a man now. Or as Ralph Ellison, his character in his novel Invisible Man, says, when after years of humiliating attempts to fit into a racist society in the United States, when he first addresses a vast crowd of black Americans at a political meeting, and I'm citing, something strange and miraculous and transforming is taking place in me right now. As I stand here before you, I feel suddenly that I have become more human. I feel that here, after a long and desperate and uncommonly blind journey, I've come home. I am a new citizen of the country of your vision, a native of your fraternal land. Conversely, Israel claimed the right of self-defense in its attack on Gaza. Indeed, the only legitimate war under international law is one of self-defense. Although considering the fact that Gaza is occupied territory, that is not a completely satisfactory argument. Be that as it may, fighting a legal war does not legitimize severe breaches of international law. The war may be legitimate, but if you are carrying it out in illegitimate ways, you can still be found as guilty of breaches of international law. Indeed, Israel has declared its intention and is currently in the process of implementing a systematic destruction of Gaza, including its educational, cultural, and health facilities, whose goal is to make it uninhabitable for the majority or large parts of the Palestinian population. In other words, it is attempting to destroy the part of the Palestinian people living in Gaza, in whole or in part, as such. This genocidal operation is being carried out with almost complete impunity, and is therefore also threatening the existence of the entire international legal edifice put into place after World War II. The country most responsible for allowing the continuation of this undertaking, because of the help that it is giving both materially and diplomatically, is the United States, without whose constant military and political support the fighting would have ended many months ago. In fact, in November or December 2023, President Biden could have stopped the war within 2 weeks, and he refused to do so. In view of this dismal reality, and that will take me to the I try to imagine or to assess what are the possible future scenarios of the present crisis. Now, I should add, as we know right now, there are negotiations over a hostage deal under massive pressure from the incoming Trump administration. My own sense is that, however, even if it happens, it's not going to put an end to the violence for more than a limited stretch of time. So I sketched two alternatives. The first is that Israel will continue its operations, perhaps eventually at a lower intensity, into the future, thereby creating a full-blown de jure apartheid regime in the West Bank and Gaza. One way that the Trump administration may act is to tell Netanyahu, you have to stop this, this is costing us a lot of money, we've already paid $20 billion, you want the northern Gaza, okay, you can take it. You want Area C in the West Bank, you can take it. So to allow Israel to annex large territories as a price for putting an end to the violence, but of course that would not put an end to the violence. So this system will inevitably, this apartheid system will, and has already in many ways, seep into Israel proper. First targeting Palestinian citizens and progressively emptying the citizenship of its content, and then also turning against the Jewish citizens who oppose it or fail to conform to its increasingly regressive, oppressive, and undemocratic norms. This is a process that we're seeing actually right now. As the regime becomes increasingly authoritarian, the legal system weakens and adapts, and violence becomes ever more prevalent. Israel will grow impoverished and isolated, a pariah state. The Jewish communities around the world will feel embarrassed to be associated with, even as they will likely also face a growing tide of anti-Semitism. Members of the liberal professions and persuasions are already leaving or will leave in the future, and Israel's allies will distance themselves from it, as its claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East will be shown to be nothing more than a farce. This condition could last for a few decades, but eventually is likely to lead to the state's implosion, as happened in South Africa. But by then, much blood will have been shed and much suffering endured, and the civil rights struggle that will follow might be just as bloody. The second, more optimistic but less likely scenario is that Israel and the Palestinians will be compelled to change the entire political paradigm under which they are now living. Only the United States is in a position to use the current tragedy as an opportunity, whose goal will be to find a political solution for the 14 million Jews and Palestinians living between the river and the sea, that will enable them to share the land within whichever political framework they choose, a binational state, two states, or a confederation, ensuring equality, justice, and dignity for all. Opinion polls indicate that even today, this is what most people in the region prefer. And it is also what most Sunni Arab countries in the region would support. But it can happen only under a firm and determined American leadership, and we are unlikely to see that in the foreseeable future. So with this, I will stop my talk, and I hope to have many questions. Thank you.
In probably the greatest, undoubtedly the greatest historian that's ever taught at Birkbeck was Eric Hobsbawm. And Eric Hobsbawm, his last major book was The Age of Empires. And in the early 1990s, he gave a lecture in this university, which later became The Age of Empires. And And Eric reflected that he was on the losing side of history, but perhaps he could gain for historical understanding what he had lost politically, because Eric was a lifelong communist, and communism after 1989 was dead. Now, Omer is not as deterministic as Eric, and one message from his lecture this evening is that it's not over, and that there remains much to fight for. Regardless of that, and that's a lot, but regardless of that, what he has given us is a huge gain for our understanding of our current discontents. Thank you so much.